In the model view controller pattern, the view is the thing the user interacts with in your application. The V in MVC, and as far as most users are concerned, it is your application. This is all that the user can actually see of all the work that you've done. Its sole job is to show data to the user wrapped up in a nice presentable way, and to receive data from that user, and that's all. With a web application, this typically means that the view is represented in HTML. It doesn't always have to be the case, however. Other types of views can be used in place of HTML, including Silverlight or Flash. In this section, I'll be covering the very basics of the ASP.NET MVC view and how information from your application is rendered back to the user. I'll discuss the mechanics involved, and then finally we'll do some very basic view work. So to get started, let's consider the basic thing that we're doing, which is handling requests for resources on our server. In the most basic scenario, this means mapping incoming URLs to a file on disk, which the web server then reads and transmits back to you via HTTP. Your browser receives the HTML and renders pretty colors and pictures, and everyone's happy. Things never stay simple, however, and these days most requests for a web resource are fulfilled using some level of just-in-time technology, which intervenes to fulfill a user's request. ASP.NET is just such a technology. The user request begins in roughly the same way, with a resource being located on disk. However, that's where the similarity ends. When an ASPX page is invoked, it instantiates a system.web.page class, which kicks off a cycle of events and calls to the .NET framework executing your code, and a whole lot more. ASP.NET MVC works a little bit differently, however, in that requests are not mapped to resources on disk. Instead, a mechanism called routing intervenes and takes a request and maps it off to a handler, which, in essence, treats a request like a remote procedure call. So let's take a look at this in some detail, starting with an incoming request to our ASP.NET MVC application. The request comes in and is intercepted by the URL routing module. It analyzes the URL and decides if the request can be fulfilled by a resource on disk, an image or CSS file, for instance. If so, the request is handed off to the core ASP handler and fulfilled with the file on disk. If not, the iRoute handler is invoked, which in our case is the MVC handler. The MVC handler kicks up some context for the MVC framework to use, a bunch of magic happens, and a response, typically HTML, is rendered back to the user. In fact, you can see this routing module, if you like, if you crack open the web.config of any ASP.NET MVC application. Just scroll on down to the HTTP modules, and there is the URL routing module sitting there, waiting to be invoked. Okay, so there's a lot of information here, and we kind of just cruised right through it. And let's go into a bit more detail, in maybe a bit of a different way, maybe something that I could understand. Let's say you've been sucked into a web server running ASP.NET MVC in the matrix. Requests for information are streaming in through terminals from all over. Inside the server, the URL routing module is listening and monitoring all these terminals and requests. He's been given explicit instructions by us in the global.asix. He's listening for certain request patterns. In this case, we've told him to use the default catch-all route, which matches every single request coming in to the ASP.NET MVC ship. If a route is matched, the MVC route handler is invoked, which returns an MVC handler. The MVC handler is the boss of ASP.NET MVC, and once invoked, it will use the data handed to it from the URL routing module in the form of a request context. Take that data to find the one controller which best matches the criteria passed into it from routing. The good news for the MVC handler is that the choice is not his alone. Instead, he defers the choice to the controller factory, which acts as an oracle of sorts, matching the one controller with the task at hand. Controller jumps into the action, firing its execute method, which loads up a controller action invoker, passing in all the context data, including routing information. The action invoker finds the appropriate action method based on the action name and the routing information, and this action is then executed, returning an action result. The action result is a view result, which is the most common type returned by action methods, and the content is rendered out by the view result, which is usually HTML, and it will be written directly to the HTTP response. I'll cover that in detail in just a few moments. Let's see how this all comes together for a developer. And we'll do the basics of view work. We'll return nothing and then go from there. Start working with view templates as well as the master page. In this demo, let's take a simple look at how a request is taken from a user, from the browser, and pushed through the machinery of the URL routing controllers, action results, and so on to end up as HTML. So what I want to do is I'm going to make things a little bit more difficult for myself. I want to build this from the ground up and make this as simple a demo as I possibly can. So here is a very simple ASP.NET MVC2 website. And this is currently in Visual Studio 2008. However, just know for future demos, I will be switching over to 2010 to show you differences between ASP.NET MVC1 and ASP.NET MVC2. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to strip out the action or the account controller and the home controller. Before I do, let's really quickly run the site so you can see that it is indeed the default template here. Here we go. And it says welcome to MVC, and if I try and log on, we get pushed over to the account controller that comes with the project template, and I'm able to log into the site. Alright, well, as I said, I want to make things pretty difficult on myself, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete these things. There we go. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out all the views, because we don't need those either. Finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the global ASAX. And I'm going to come in here and delete out the route registration. And then I'm going to delete out the call to it from application start. There we go. Now let's slowly put the pieces back together and see what happens with our request every time we add a piece back in. Before we do much of anything, let's see what happens when we tell the site to run and we get what's called a 404 error. Meaning the request cannot be fulfilled by the server. It doesn't. We can overcome this error rather easily if we right click and we can add a new item here. And what I can do is I can add an HTML page and I'll call it default.htm. This is the default page for any site in the root or in a directory. And if the URL module sees that, it will defer to this and will actually serve this page rather than hand control off to the MVC handler. So what I can do is I can simply say hello. And if we run the site one more time, great, we get hello. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but we have a brand new spanking ASP.NET MVC2 website, so we really don't want to be serving up HTML pages. So I'm going to leave this page here for right now, because what I want to do right now is I want to start putting the machinery back together. So first thing I need to do is I need to tell the URL routing module that it has some routes to try and match, so it doesn't have 404 returned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method here called register routes. And this method is going to simply take in a single type here called route collection, and we'll set it to be routes. There we go. And what we're going to do with routes is we are simply going to map our default route. We're going to create what is called the catch-all. And to do that, we simply want to invoke map route. There we go. And we're going to give it a name, and we'll call this default. Although we don't need to, we can call this catch-all if we like to. Okay, next thing we need to do is to give it a pattern to match on so it knows what it's looking for. So we can do this using curly braces. That tells URL routing that what you see coming next is optional. In this case, what we're thinking it might come in is the controller name specified through the URL. URL routing is going to look at this and it's going to see that each one of these arguments is optional in this pattern. So if it can't find this value here in the first place position, and it can't find this and it can't find this, it's going to say, well, all right, I still match on this. In fact, this whole thing can look like this if it wants to. The final thing that we need to do here is we need to specify some defaults. You want to do that every single time you have an optional argument here for a URL route. In this case, every single one of these is optional, and so since this is our default catch-all route, we're probably going to want to specify what controller and action a default request should land on. So I'm going to use the object initializer that is new to 3.5 C#, And I'm just going to open up the curly brace here, and I'm going to tell it that controller value that you're looking for, it is going to be home. Notice I just typed in home. I did not type in controller. This is one of those conventions from ASP.NET MVC. The name of a controller is actually the word that is in front of the actual string controller. Next, I want to specify the default action to go to. This is going to be the method that gets executed on our controller class. In this case, it's going to be index. And finally, a default value for ID is just an empty string. Okay, that is our default route. It is our default catch-all. So now it's got a place to go. I'm going to leave default.htm in there, however, just to show that indeed URL routing will defer to a page on disk even if it has a route that matches. Okay, the last thing I need to do is I actually need to call this method right here. So I'm going to do that. Do it straight away here. And I'm going to pass in route table dot routes. Okay, that is all set and ready to go. We have our URL routing maps set up right here. We have harnessed that URL route map to our application itself. So now URL routing module has something to listen for. So I hit run, and we still see hello. This is exactly what we would expect because, again, routing defers to a page on disk. And we have that. So now if I delete this page and I run the site one more time, we will get a 404 error. Now this is because the MVC handler was invoked and the controller factory tried to find a controller. It couldn't find that controller, so it threw a 404 exception. It did not throw a yellow screen of death notice because this is not an application stopping error. This just simply means that a request was handed to it and it didn't know what to do. Okay, well, let's fix that problem. What I need to do now is I need to go ahead and add a controller. So I'm going to do that right here. I'm going to pull this window open so you can see what I'm about to do. The simplest thing you can do is to use the tooling, and you right-click, add controller, and I'm going to call this the home controller, and we'll hit add. And every time a controller is added to a web application here using the tooling, a brand new spanking index action is created for us. This action is the default action for this controller. You know, if I renamed this something different, then it wouldn't have a default and we wouldn't know where to look for it, and the controller factory would get mighty confused as to which action it should return. Okay, we don't want to do that. Okay, well now we have action result index. We're good to go. And just to show you that everything should be in working order, routing is doing its job, we get a yellow screen of death. Now that error changed in this case because the controller was found, the action was found. However, the action could not be carried out because it didn't have a view. Okay, well, what we can do here is we can actually fix this problem straight away. What I can do is I can just return a simple string. And I can simply say return and then a string value. Of course, this is not a very good idea. But this is just to show you that it'll work. And I rerun the site, and what I get instead is a response. Hello. Notice I didn't need to have an actual view on disk. I can return things straight into the stream from a controller if I choose. All right, well that is not obviously a very good idea. Just to show you one other thing, I don't actually have to return anything out of here. And what I can do instead is just simply say response.write. And once again, I'll say hello. And I'll run this. And once again, we'll get hello. Okay, well, there's a much better way that we can do this. And clearly, we don't want to have to write all of our HTML inside of our controllers. This is where separation of concerns comes in. We've heard this notion before, but a controller should only handle data in from a user and pull data out of the system to hand back to the user. It should not concern itself with silly things like this, returning things straight to the response stream and marking things up like I've just showed you. Instead, what it should do is hand that responsibility off to something else entirely. In this case, it'll be the framework and the view engine. So what I can do here is I can simply now return, and I'll reset this to be an action result. There we go. So we can return a brand new view result, and what this is going to do is it's going to invoke the view engine one more time, and that view engine is going to go and try and find a view that will carry out the home index action result. And if we run this, you notice we get the very same error. Can't find that. Well, we do have a helper method in here because we don't want to be returning new objects out of our controller every single time. So instead of doing this, we can simply just shorten this to a little sugar that Phil and team have added for us, called return view. Okay, well, it's clear now that we don't have a view to return. So what we can do here is we can actually add one. So I can use the tooling for this, and right inside here I can say add view. And it knows to be called index because we're inside the index action. We don't really want a master page just yet, so I'm just going to hit add. And notice what the tooling did. It created a directory for us right under the views directory, and it created a view for us called index.aspx. So in here, I can now add my HTML. And if I run this, we get to see the message that we've been waiting for. This is a much more efficient way of doing this, putting the HTML where it belongs and letting the view engine handle this. So let's recap the entire rendering cycle one more time. To start with, the URL routing module listens for requests. Once it finds one, the MVC handler is handed control for that matched request. That handler asks the controller factory to find the controller and run its execute method. The controller action invoker is then pulled up and created, and it finds the action result and calls execute result on that controller. View engine is invoked if the action result is a view result, and the view page is rendered to the response. Now that we have the view page rendering properly, let's go ahead and tidy things up a bit, and I will show you how you can use the basic machinery of ASP.NET MVC2 views to tidy up the HTML and use an old friend called the site master page. We have our action and our view working pretty well. However, if you take a look at the HTML that is involved with this view, it's pretty easy to see that it is suboptimal. We are including doc type tag as well as the HTML tag, various head information, body, and so on inside of our view. That it's not at all what they call dry or don't repeat yourself. So what we're going to do instead of doing this is we're going to extend a aspect of the web forms view engine called master pages. And if you're familiar with ASP.NET, then you are familiar, most likely, with master pages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply add a directory in here. I'm going to pull this over so you can see it. And I'm going to add a directory into the views, and I'm going to call it shared. This is by convention, as this directory will be scanned as well as everything inside of here for a particular type of view. So then inside of here, I'm going to add a new item, and that new item is going to be an MVC view master page, which is this little guy right here. Actually, I'm going to use MVC2 view master page. There we go. And site.master. And then we'll add that in. Okay, well, now that that's in place, we can add some HTML in here if we like, some CSS. Just for this, I am going to set the background. There we go. And this is just so we know what we're looking at. So now that we have this in place, what we can do is we can come back to our home controller and we can go and add a view. Now, if you have already created a bunch of views and you're not wanting to delete them like I am doing here, you certainly don't have to. You just simply need to add in some content tags and make sure that it sets up the site master as well as you normally would. Okay, well, in this case, we want to select a master page, and to do that, well, it automatically looks inside of the views shared directory for site.master. We'll say OK. And now when we create the view, we have a content placeholder just like this. So on our site.master, you notice we have two placeholders. We have title content and main content already created for us. This is by convention. This is, again, one of those tooling things where the template created these content placeholders just for us. And back here, everything is just fine. And we can once again type in hello. Great. So now we can run this. I'll pull my browser up so you can see it. And we have our nice green page. That's exciting. Well, what else can we do here? We don't have to settle for green if we don't want. We can also, if we'd like to, have a brand new item in here. And once again, we're going to choose a master page, but this time, let's do something a little bit more funky. We'll call this black.master. And it's going to be the same thing, except this time, we're going to set the background. Oops, we'll just set a style. We'll set the background color to black. And in addition, we're going to set the font color to white. just so we can see the fonts. Great. Okay, well now that we have a new master, how are we going to specify which one our view is going to use? Well, we have two ways of doing that. First thing that we can do is we can come back into our view here and we can take a look and we can see that indeed the master page file is specified right here. It is hard-coded right on the page. We can change this to be black if we want, or we can override it in our home controller. And inside of here we could override this view. We can also specify the master. So there we go. So now when I run this, I should see the black background, and I do. So that's one way to override the master page that gets popped out onto the screen.